Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Michael Posey on the show, and today we're answering the questions, what is DMARC, what is DKIM, and what is SPF? Now, these are 3 email authentication protocols that I'm quite often surprised that IT pros, they see these protocols, they've seen the acronyms, but they don't really understand what they are or how they function. And those are the questions that Michael Posey and I are aiming to answer today on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and I've got Michael Posey with me today. How's it going, Michael?
Good, Andy. How are you?
Doing good. Hey, I think this is your second or third time on the show. I don't remember. Yeah. I know you've been here at least once.
I think it's second.
Yeah, gotcha. So it's your second time. Well, it's good having you back. And we're, of course, talking about SPF, DKIM, and DMARC today. But before we get into that topic, for the folks that may not know who you are, can you give us a quick introduction of yourself and what you do for Hornet Security?
Yeah, so I've sort of been in the space, working with the channel for the last 17 years, specifically around email security. And that sort of expanded on, to email archiving, encryption, web security, DNS security, et cetera, and primarily focused around the channel, so MSPs, right? So I help them understand the products and services, help them to build business cases around new products and offerings, and to help deliver them to their customers. So this sort of topics that we cover here, I think they're near and dear to my heart. But yeah, it's something that is cool. Now with Hornet, what I do is I tend to look after some of our larger partners to make sure that they have all the technical acuity that they need from our side, whether that's training their technicians to providing in-depth research, escalation points, product feature requests, those types of things, to champion those internally to make sure that they're heard and that they don't have to spend a lot of resources and effort to, have their voices heard from the corporate side.
Right. It's always nice to have somebody who's kind of what I consider to be boots on the ground, talking with customers, kind of on that front line of the security ecosystem, because you actually see the attacks, you actually see stuff as it's happening, right? It's not just theoretical. Right. So it's always good to have folks like you on the show. So I appreciate your time today to come and talk with us. So what I wanted to do with this particular episode, I kind of mentioned we're going to talk about SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, right? These are email authentication protocols. And I'd like to get your take on this a little bit, Michael. From where I sit, what I've seen in the industry is your general run-of-the-mill IT professional. They know about these protocols. They've heard about them, but they don't necessarily understand what they are, specifically how they work, and more importantly, where they fit in kind of that email defense chain. Is that kind of what you've seen as well?
It is to a degree. I think, these are types of services, I'll call them services because they are, and settings that, generally you set once and you forget it unless you make a major change. So I think these are just technologies that don't come up in everyday conversations. Right. So research is done when it's needed. And really from a pure management perspective, if you aren't really interested in the technology behind it, but you're managing the IT sort of stance or security stance, that these settings have to be in place. There's a lot of tools and also a lot of documentation from whatever services you use that say, hey, this is what your SPF record should be. And you just go into your DNS registrar, your DNS host, and say, done, and you're off to the races. And typically the only time it really ever comes back up is if there's a new service that's sitting on your behalf and there's an issue delivering mail.
Right.
So.
Right. And I
had one yesterday, actually.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. They added a new service, and we're getting bounce backs from one specific recipient that said, sender policy framework error. And they're like, what does this mean? I'm like, you have an SPF issue. What's sending this? And we had to sort of dig through that to figure out, what was causing the bounce.
Right. And I mean, I could probably say this about most security things, but to your point, like, you kind of set it and forget it, and you probably never come back around to investigate it to see if it's working correctly. I guess for some services, people operate, perhaps wrongly in some cases, under the assumption that no news is good news, right? And so what I wanted to do with this episode is kind of dive into each of those protocols, why they're important, how they work, and what they ultimately help with, right? Now, from a high level, these are all involved in basically authenticating and proving that this email is actually coming from the organization that it says it's coming from. So these are all intended to help with organization spoofing, right? If that way, for example, I can't go and set up a mail server here in my basement and start sending emails as michaelposey.com, right?
I mean, you could.
I could, right. But SPF, DKIM, DMARC are designed
Right.
to shine a great big light on that happening.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely, right. So the DKIM works on, they all sort of have a hand in each other's sort of actions, right? It goes from SPF to DKIM to DMARC. And SPF is sort of the basics, right? It says, hey, these are the mail servers that are allowed to send with this domain name. And some providers, what you're seeing is, or some companies are saying, hey, if this doesn't match, we don't want the message.
Yeah.
Because if it's not an approved sender, we're going to consider that it's an attack or trash, and we just don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
And that, I think, the fog of war, or whatever you want to call it, that's happened with SPF, we were talking about this before, is 4 years ago, I think the SPF acceptance rate or what people were using was like 30%. And as of today, we just did a quick study and it was over 90%. And I think some of the things that have helped with that is maybe some of the adoptions of 365 on Microsoft side, where, it's just there as a record. And as you kind of go through and you set up your link record, your Skype records or your Teams records and all those things that you may or may not use or know what they're used for, it's one of those line items that you just simply put in place and have it done, which is a great thing. So, it's good.
And so, I mean, from the admin's perspective, it's one of those go here, do this thing on the checklist, right? And so, that certainly helps with adoption. And I want to, just for clarity's sake here, you mentioned this earlier, but SPF, of course, stands for Sender Policy Framework. And to reiterate what you said, that's basically saying that these servers are allowed to send email on behalf of this domain, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I came across a Reddit post. I'll have to put the link in the show notes. But this one comment put SPF, DKIM, and DMARC probably in the most simplest form and the most succinctly as I've ever seen a description of these protocols, and that is for SPF, it was something along the lines of, you'll only ever get emails from me from these sources, right? Is basically what SPF is doing. So now SPF has been around.
I'll challenge that a little bit. I think SPF, when you have that, and DMARC, depending on, it all deals with acceptance, right? I think if we take that a little bit and use that same idea, is that you'll only receive messages from my domain, or you should only receive messages from my domain from these mail servers. And then it's up to the receiving party to decide how they want to handle that, whether they quarantine it, reject it, or whatever else. Because there are options in SPF. There's soft fails and hard fails, and those are handled differently as well. So, I mean, it's I like the idea to simplify it, because it can be complicated to explain. But no, it's absolutely right. It's not a terribly complex service. It's just, again, something that doesn't come up every day, and you don't necessarily see the benefit of it from what it's actually protecting, right? You're throwing the rocks outside of your protected fort. You don't know where they're landing or what they're doing with it, but you know that other people can't impersonate that. So it's sorry.
And I think something else you said there is very important. We can configure all of these protocols as we want to for our domains, right? But it's up to the recipient's end as to what they do with that information, right? So I think that's important, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But
yeah, and standards help with that, right? And it's
yes,
important for people to follow standards, but there's a lot of rogue IT companies, mail servers, et cetera, that just don't follow standards
yep,
because they forgot to set something up or they just refuse to set something up. So
yep. Yep, for sure. Or it's one of those cases where, it's your uncle's nephew's best friend's cousin who is doing IT for your small business, right? And they just don't know any better, right? You have that
yeah.
type of situation sometimes too. So, anyway, so we've talked about SPF. Next on the list here is DKIM, which stands for Domain Keys Identified Mail. And basically what DKIM does is it takes a digital signature. This uses cryptography, public key cryptography, and it takes a digital signature, attaches it to each mail item that basically shows that, okay, this piece of mail, is authentic. And kind of, again, in that simplified term, if you see an email from me that does not have this digital signature, it's probably not from me. It's basically at a simplified level what DKIM is doing.
Yep. Yeah, and you can use a metaphor here or sort of an analogy that says, think of a marathon runner, right? They register for the race, they get a bib, right? So they're identified. And as they run that race, they go through various checkpoints where they get checked off that make sure that person is there and everything else. And when they finish that, they have a log of the person who registered, their gates through the race that they've been sort of identified through. So a mail going through servers that's still in that authenticated state that hasn't been molested in any way. And then as it gets delivered, those domain keys are still intact. So we know that everything happened great. Now, if that domain key wasn't intact or the runner set a new world's record for a marathon, they can then go back and go, okay, well, this is where it was. We don't think that this is a valid result, so we can get away or throw this message away. But then they can go back and research what happened, where it happened, and that way it prevents people from modifying the message after it was sent. And it's that idea that there's stops and measures along the way to make sure that the message is truly authentic from start to finish. Which helps with your brand, right? Whether that's your MSP practice or a nonprofit or anything else, it helps to make sure that this message, along like with SPF, is coming from an authenticated mail server, and it is exactly how it was sent, and you're receiving it in the exact same format, which is important, right?
Correct. So it's not just this message came from me, because that's kind of what SPF has a hand in, right? And DKIM kind of builds on that. But to your point, and I'm glad you brought that up, it also verifies that it has not been tampered with, in transit.
It's like the wax seal in old letters, right? The seal hasn't been broken. We know that it came from you to me, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's obviously ways to fake that, but that's the whole idea and the premise of it is no one's tampered with it, no one's read it, and here's your message.
Right. And I think that's the important bit. It's a good analogy, right? The old wax seal. So I think that still stands up today. So some of those old examples work really well. Like I did a video, I think back in February. It's been a while now, but I was just kind of explaining I'll link the video in the show notes, but I was explaining the basics of how cryptography works under the hood, right? And whenever I'm talking about that in terms of basics, I always go over the Caesar cipher. If you're not familiar with what the Caesar cipher is, old school surprise from Roman times where, each letter in the message, you go back 7 letters in the alphabet, and that's the letter that is in your message. And so if you know what the offset is, you can decrypt the message, right? And I feel like it does a good job of explaining cryptography. Obviously, our ciphers today are vastly more complicated than that, but I feel like it's a good example.
Yeah,
anyway.
And to your point, security is not anything new.
Yes, correct.
So, and even, the ancient Egyptians in some of the tombs have identified as using some sort of encryption in some of the messages that they use, because they would use unusual or different hieroglyphics that would normally be used in those situations to convey different meanings, to obfuscate the message. And then you can go, more recent terms that where encryption's used, and obviously being able to break those ciphers can be a major challenge, is like the Enigma device. So Alan Turing's work on creating a, for lack of better terms, a supercomputer, mechanical computer, whatever, to be able to decode those messages, ultimately is also credited for, ending World War II as quickly as it was.
Yeah, definitely. There's so much history to encryption. I feel like we could do just a whole episode just on that. Maybe we should at some point. But
that'd be fun.
It would. I love the description of cryptography on Wikipedia. If folks have a chance, go to Wikipedia, search for cryptography. There is a description there that I think explains cryptography perfectly. It's something along, I'm not quoting it exactly, but it's something along the lines of the transmission of sensitive information within adversarial environments, right? I think is what it says, if I remember correctly. So it's... I feel like it describes it perfectly. So anyway, we're getting away from our main topic, which is want to happen on this show from time to time, which is fine. So, but I want to get to our third protocol that we're talking about today. We talked about SPF, we talked about DKIM. Now we've got DMARC. So DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting and Conformance. It's a mouthful. But basically, what DMARC does is, I think you mentioned it earlier, Michael, is it kind of brings the other two protocols together and it says, okay, what do I, the receiving mail server, what do I do when SPF and or DKIM checks fail, right? And so you've got three options. You can either do nothing and just accept the message, or you can quarantine it for further review, or you can reject it, right? And I know there's another option in the DMARC setting where there's a percentage that you can define. So I want DMARC to apply to 70% of the messages that come through. Personally, I've always set it to 100. I don't know why you wouldn't want to.
I don't know either.
Maybe if you're doing something weird like a honeypot or something, or maybe you're dealing with insane amounts of I don't know. I'll have to think on that one a little bit. I can't think of a good reason to not set it to 100, but that's just me.
If you're getting the email report, because that's obviously an option too, and someone is targeting your domain or impersonating your domain, like you said, an insane amount, 1 million times a day, and all these different mail servers are emailing you and actually following the protocol, you may not want to get as much of those. So you may reduce that and just know, hey, this is going to happen. It's something we have to live with. And I just want to see just the activity as it kind of goes along.
Right.
I've never seen anybody set it less than 100% though, to be honest.
Anyway, I wanted to mention that at least for completeness here, but like you said, Michael, it kind of brings the other two protocols together and, what do you do when the SPF and DKIM check fails? And so, I think that's the important one. And again, you have to, as the receiving entity, you have to configure your mail services or your email security services to, do you want them to, look for DMARC checks, that type of thing. You have to configure that. But in terms of configuring these for your domain, so you're the sending entity, right? You want to protect your domain with these. These are all just DNS text records is all they are. So you go out to your DNS provider, you add a record for each one. I will include some links to documentation with more written information on each of these protocols, so you kind of have an idea of, what to do, how to set that up, that type of thing. But not that hard to set up. And I know here's another thing that surprises me about some sysadmins out there. I still run into this where people are afraid to touch DNS. And don't get me wrong, with great power comes great responsibility, right? But just be careful and triple check before you commit that record change, right?
Yeah.
But my point is, don't be afraid of DNS because you can do some really cool stuff with DNS, like these protocols. Anyway.
And they update the protocols too. Like there was I think it was the Type 99 SPF record. It was actually an SPF dot your domain name. And those were deprecated several years ago. So It's now just a text record to make it easier, to make the process that much more adoptable. Because some DNS hosts just weren't accepting or letting you create that subdomain to be a text record. So it's important to understand that technologies do change, and then, requirements change, and standards update. So it's always good to see where that's coming. And there's lots of tools out there that'll let you know if you have a setting that's maybe kind of old by, 10 years or so, and you might need to change it.
Right.
But it still works. So.
Yep, for sure. So we kind of talked about what the three protocols are, Michael. Just from a completeness point of view, and we've kind of mentioned this as we've stepped through a little bit, but why do we need these things? And the three big reasons, well, two of them for sure. The third one is kind of a question mark for me, but the two big ones for sure. Reputation, right? If I'm running a business, I don't want somebody sending emails that are pretending to be me, right? Because there's all kinds of mischief that person can get up to by pretending to be me. These authentication protocols are designed to protect against that, right? The other thing is we've got, we talk about adoption rates. So you mentioned the adoption rate of SPF is like 90%. As the industry continues to adopt these authentication protocols, we are effectively taking away one of one of threat actors' main social engineering tactics, and that is impersonation, right? Actually impersonating and spoofing a brand. And so the more we adopt these protocols as an industry, the better we are there, right? And the third one, and I would love to get listeners' feedback on this, because it's, I'm not trudging through compliance controls day in and day out, but if it is not already, I have to imagine at some point there are certain compliance frameworks that are going to start requiring that these protocols be in place. If any of you know that as a fact, you can always drop me an email at andy@hornetsecurity.com. I'm really curious on that.
And there's companies that do. If you don't have an SPF record, we don't want your mail. So they put in some policies like that. And I think the other thing too that really these policies really help to sort of foster is a more secure environment, right? Because if everyone had all these records created for their domain names, you can then authenticate the validity of those messages and the authenticity of those messages, that are coming into your mail server, and then you could also then report or action how that sender wishes any impersonated attempts to be made. And it's all about, taking power away from some of those bad actors to create these policies to help structure these things and have that one sort of standard instead of it being the Wild West. I mean, obviously that still works, but the whole idea is to have these standards where people can, one, choose how their domains are handled when messages come out, to authenticate how their messages are being sent and delivered. And then, the idea is if everyone had this, then messaging would start to become a little bit more secure as a whole.
Right.
Because you can't you're taking impersonation out of the way, outside of maybe just a name and hiding the email domain. Maybe some of your man-in-the-middle attacks will start to go away too, where they can hijack a piece of mail and reinsert it into the stream. And then just all about reporting and ownership. So.
Yep, for sure. On top of that, one other thing I wanted to make sure we mentioned and talked about as part of this this conversation, like so many really cool security controls like DMARC, DKIM, and SPF, you can't rely on them solely. That can't, like so many things in security, there's no magic silver bullet that solves every issue, right? And so these services, they're not infallible. They're not perfect. It doesn't prevent situations where, maybe I'm a threat actor and I actually go out and compromise the mail server for michaelposey.com, right? And now I can send email all day as Michael from his own mail server, right? And it doesn't matter, right? And so it doesn't help with those situations. But again, it's about that whole defense in depth strategy, creating multiple layers of pain, security. I guess I would say, for the threat actor to go through in order to compromise your services, right?
Yep.
So,
it's about layering security, and this is just one of those pieces. And obviously, your security stance is only as strong as the weakest link. So,
correct.
A lot of times people say, "Hey, it's the end user that's your weakest link." But they can also be your strongest adversary as well. So, get them trained, make sure everything's in place, teach them what they should be looking for, and things typically go a lot better. But it's one of those things that it's just a link in the chain. that you got to make sure is there and strong, and it's protecting you.
For sure. For sure. Well, as complex as some people think these protocols are, Michael, we've actually covered them as much as I think we need to on this show.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add before we wrap things up?
No, I mean it's one of those things that if you don't have these services set up, I think take the few minutes to see if your services offer them, and if they do offer them, take the extra few minutes and actually set it up. And even if you don't get the reporting that like DMARC offers you, that's okay. You can still say, hey, if this isn't coming from an authenticated server and it doesn't meet all these properties, just go and reject the piece of mail. And then that way you can rest assured that if they're following standards, that if someone does impersonate your domain, then that receiving mail server can throw that message away so that they don't have to depend on any sort of spam checks or impersonation checks or those types of things to guarantee that the message is safe. You can proactively say these messages are safe, or these I can't say they're safe, so get rid of them. And literally, you can have these set up in literally 5 minutes of getting those records. So it's not difficult. It's something you can easily put in place, and I do recommend that you do it. The adoption is key. The more people that adopt, the safer the environment in the world's going to be in terms of just message delivery, not weather and things like that. But
For sure. And then for those folks that are interested, I will be sure to put a whole bunch of links in the show notes to additional resources, tools, and knowledge-based articles that you guys can use to learn more about these protocols and get the nitty-gritty details as well. So, but anyway, I think that about does it for us today, Michael. Want to thank you for taking some time to come and share your knowledge and insights. It was a good conversation. Always good having you, my friend.
Yeah, thanks. Pleasure being here. And I can't wait for number 3/4.
Yeah, we'll get you on the books. We'll have to plan it. So appreciate it. Sounds like a plan.
Yeah,
so.
of course.
And those of you watching, appreciate you spending some time with us. And if you found value in today's episode, be sure to smash that like and subscribe button if you're watching on the YouTubes. Otherwise, you can find us on all the major podcasting platforms. So chances are, wherever you consume your content, you can probably find us. If you want more information on Hornet Security, go out to hornetsecurity.com. Other than that, we'll let you get back to your day. Stay safe out there. We'll see you again next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Have a good one.